All right, welcome everybody to our class, Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. This will be the second part of the introduction to the book of Judges here. And you may remember from the timeline here or the schedule of class. So we're getting down close to halfway with the class here. I think we've got 33 or 34 class periods here, so we're getting close to halfway. But we are going to wrap up getting into the book, and then we're going to look a little bit at the first cycle just very quickly. I don't want to take away anything from, I think Josh is teaching on Sunday, if I remember correctly. Excuse me. I don't want to take away too much time from him, but we are going to look at that as an example of the first cycle, if we have time. If not, then I'll leave that for him. We are going to potentially also, depending on how class goes, we may watch a 7 or 8 minute video at the end of class here that does a great job of summarizing the entire book also here. So just some brief repeat or introduction from what we covered on Sunday. We mentioned that just looking at this, it is important for us to remember just how huge of a period of time this is compared to all the other periods of time in Israel's history. Other than perhaps their time in Egypt, it is the longest period of their history that we would be able to mark when we list that out there. And we said that it's important to remember that judge is misleading. When we think of a judge, we think of our judicial system, somebody who's making judgment based on laws and things like that. And it's not really the case there. And many people, we pointed out, make the mistake, and they go back to Exodus chapter 18, verses 21 to 22, where God told Moses to set up judges that would take care of the more day-to-day stuff and leave him free to handle some of the bigger nationwide things. And then just because those judges are mentioned again in the book of Joshua, many people think that that's what carried forward into the book of Judges, and that's who these people are, but that is not the case, okay, because it's definitely not the same here. So we talked about who are they. They're mostly common people who, because of circumstances, God calls them into leadership. The Spirit of God will come upon them and give them either power or insight or some kind of advantage over their enemies in order to fulfill God's will. They either were or they were just common people who became military leaders. That really is their primary role, is to fight battle for Israel here. They are locally important, not nationally. And of course, they had various degrees of influence depending on there's major and there's minor judges, and just really major, minor depends on how much we know about them, just like the major and minor prophets there. The political structure of the time, the tribes are all independent. There's no central government. God was their king. And of course, the one thing that is supposed to tie them together is that relationship to God and their religion. So there is the local priesthood, and there is a hierarchy within the priesthood that they report up to the high priest that is in Shiloh, where the tabernacle is during this period. And really, that priesthood is what's supposed to knit the nation together and to keep them as a nation, but they don't really do a great job on that. And their borders are constantly shifting, both internally between the tribes and externally as other nations grow or get weaker comparative to them. And we'll look at a map there in just a minute of that. Definitely they are militarily vulnerable. The standing army that was under Joshua has been completely disbanded, so they are then unable to withstand even some of the smaller countries that are around them. Of course, really the reason they were not able to withstand those other countries is because God actually fights on the side of those other countries because of their unfaithfulness here, as we'll see. And as we mentioned already, they were definitely regional events and regional leaders. So most of the time, only some of the tribes are affected. There's no central army ever raised. And in fact, we believe, or at least suspect, that some of the judges even probably overlapped in the time frame that they had here. And this map here, I'm not sure, should be able to see it pretty good up there. I'm not sure how well it comes through on the live stream here. But this just lists all 12 judges that are up in the book. And as you can see there, they're really spread throughout the land. So just depending on where that local strife was, that local trouble was, is where that judge was going to be raised. So when you think about the first judge, Othniel there, all the way down, happens pretty much right away after the people disband. He is the guy, Othniel is the one who becomes the son-in-law of Caleb, and he only deals with a very small rebellion down there in Judah, and so the other tribes don't even probably know anything about it. So just each judge happens and controls things around their locality, depending on the enemy here. So realistically, this is going to be what we tend to call the Wild West of Israel's history, just like somewhat in our Wild West time period of expansion here in the U.S. The people are spreading out. They're losing contact with each other. And you have to remember, in this time frame, when you think about even as much as going, 15, 20 miles down the road, that really was breaking contact. Not only no cell phones, no regular phones, no telegrams, not even really any kind of transport. Horses were not very common in this part, especially for Israel. They tend to be more having sheep and some donkeys. And so really to travel much of any distance was days at a time. And so it was not uncommon at all for people who left that you never really even heard from them again, let alone kept in contact with what's going on. And if you think about from the north side to the south side of Israel, by foot, even hoofing it, it's at least a month journey there. And so really keeping track of people was not very possible. This idea of dirty heroes were common, just like we would have some of our own, Wyatt Earp and some of those guys that we look to as heroes of the Wild West. And not all of them were really good people. They did some pretty bad things, and we're going to see that in this book also here. And the people themselves really become just a law unto themselves. If you can make it happen, might makes right kind of thing, then that really is what goes on during this period. And we are going to see this just constant moral degeneracy from the time they start out. Remember, when Joshua dies, all throughout Joshua's lifetime, the children of Israel have been what? Godly, right? They've been faithful. They listened and they obeyed, okay? And it says that they even, throughout that next generation, the elders that outlived Joshua, they were faithful. But then, when it started, people didn't fall away to the terrible case that we're going to see toward the end of the book. That didn't happen overnight. It happened over 350 to 430 years. It took a while to get that bad, but they are going to become more and more like Canaan and like the Canaanites instead of what were they supposed to do? Yeah, they were supposed to get the Canaanites out, and then even the ones that stayed, they were supposed to do what? Yeah, they were supposed to show them what God was like, right? And not the other way around. We're going to see that as we go through the book there. So a gradual but continual departure from the covenant, and we already talked about many atrocities are committed here. So, just before Joshua dies then, and we covered that on Sunday, we're not going to revisit that, but just before he dies, both in the book of Judges and in the book of Joshua, he brings all of Israel together, and he tells them, hey, I have done what God gave me to do. I have brought an army into the land. We have defeated all of their major armies. All of the major cities are basically smoking ruins. And now it is up to you to go and possess the land. Okay? So he tells them, now there is still work for you to do. You have to actually go and occupy the land. So even though the major armies have been defeated, they didn't completely depopulate those regions. There's still all the rural people and a lot of people still living in some of the minor cities there. Now it's time for the Israelites to move in and truly take over. And importantly, God says a couple things to them, and Joshua repeats that that they are supposed to drive out the inhabitants, just get them away, and don't make marriages and cling to the remnant. God always admitted there's going to be a remnant that stays behind. You're not going to get rid of 100% of all of them. I don't believe God ever really, other than perhaps the Amalekites, endorsed full-scale genocide. However, he did say, you don't cling to them and you don't go after their gods. Instead, you do what? Don't bow down to their altars. That's right. You take them to your altar and you show them Jehovah. But that is not, so let's ask that question. Do they do this? Well, let's read at the end of Judges chapter 1 here. And so Judges chapter 1, I'm going to begin in verse 27 and read the remaining 10 verses or so of that chapter there. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Iblim and its villages, the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages, for the Canaanites persisted in dwelling in that land. When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not drive them out completely. And Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, so that the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, the inhabitants of Nahalo, and the Canaanites lived among them, but became subject to forced labor. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or the inhabitants of Alab, or Akzib, or Helba, or Aphink of Rehob. So the Asherites lived among the Canaanites and the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshemesh, the inhabitants of Beneth. And I'm not going to continue to read all those names because my tongue's getting tired. But we see the story here, and if we look at that then, we have the 12 tribes, of course. And so if we have the 12 tribes listed here, as we would read through that, we find out, did each one of these tribes do what they were supposed to do or not? So Reuben, the oldest, he's actually not mentioned here, simply because he's one of the eastern tribes. What's already happened to all those people? They've left and they've gone back, okay? But I'm going to tell you right now, they didn't do it either when they got back. We'll see that. Now, Judah, yes. Judah actually drives out the majority of the inhabitants of the land. The only place that they are not successful, we looked at on Sunday, is that when they get to that very farthest plain right up against the Mediterranean Sea, it says that they are not able to take them over because of the iron chariots that those people are using. But for the most part, we can say, yes, Judah did exactly what they were supposed to do, and primarily because of one man. Who was that? Who told Joshua, let me go take my land? I'm 80 years old, but yet I'm still ready to go fight. Caleb, that's right, okay? So Caleb is really the reason, and he's been faithful the whole time, so he's really the only reason that happened. Gad, again, is not mentioned. They're one of the eastern tribes. Simeon, yes, actually Simeon pushes out the people, but not because Simeon does it, because Judah does it. Remember we read last time that Judah said to Simeon, come with me and I'll help you? That's the only reason that Simeon really pushes that out, and really because they don't have their own territory, they just have certain small section of within Judah. Issachar, also not mentioned, being one of the tribes across the eastern side. But all the rest of these are specifically mentioned here in the book as no, they did not drive them out. Okay? And so even those tribes that are on the eastern side that are not specifically mentioned, we know they didn't do it also because some of the problems that they continue to have over there. So if we were to look at a map then, this is a map that you should be somewhat familiar with by now. At least I'm sure you've seen this before, and we put it up here a couple times in class. This is a map showing what their inheritance was. So each of the tribes, whenever Joshua did his work and defeated all the armies, you may remember he gathered them at Shiloh, and he said, okay, now we're going to pick who gets what. And some of the bigger tribes got the space. Caleb got the space that was allotted to him a long time ago. And the rest of them, they sorted by lots, right? Based on the size of the people. So this is the territory that they are supposed to control. Do they really control all of that? Nope. Not even close, actually. This is really more like what they control. Okay? The tribes over on the east side, when they first go back, they do tend to control more of the section, not because they pushed the people out, but because there wasn't anybody living there anyway. Remember, why did they want that side of the Jordan? Yeah, it's just big open plains, right? Okay, think about that. When you go east there, on the east side of Jordan, when it rises up out of the Jordan Valley, it's one of the flattest sections in that entire part of the land. So it's just big open plains. There's not a lot of people living there. So they kind of tend to control that. Manasseh really fails in the north to push out some of the people that live up there, centered there in Damascus. They really failed to do that. But this is really more likely what they controlled throughout the entire period of Judges. And like we mentioned before, as we go through the book of Judges, sometimes Israel is strong when they're a little more faithful. Not very often, but mostly just right after a judge is raised, okay? And that territory might expand a little bit. But realistically, for the next 350 to 430 years, what's going to happen to even this amount of territory they control? It's going to shrink, it's going to shrink, it's going to shrink, it's going to shrink, okay? Because they just cannot stand against their enemies. So how does God then react to their lack of doing what he told them to do? Shouldn't be surprised. Is God real happy when people don't do what he says to do? No, he hates it, in fact, okay? So here in Judges chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, it says, "Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I swore to give your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land, and you shall break down their altars. But you have not obeyed my voice. You did not do what I said. What is this you have done?" I can't imagine God asking me, I told you to do this, you didn't do it, what in the world were you thinking? And they don't really have an answer, of course. So God says, "So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their gods shall become a snare unto you." I can't tell you how many times when I've taught this section or just talking to people, I very commonly get asked this kind of question. Well, why didn't God just drive them out? If he knew that they were going to be such a pain to the Israelites, and if he knew that they were going to be a primary source and a reason that his children, his selected people, were going to wander away from him and be unfaithful, then why didn't he just drive them out? I mean, after all, he would have saved Israel a ton of pain if he would have just done that. And that's probably right. But I think what we have to remember is that God is doing exactly what he said he was going to do. Remember, all the way back in the book of Exodus, in Exodus chapter 23, just after Moses comes down with the Ten Commandments and they start to give the law, and then in Exodus chapter 24, where we have the ratification of the covenant, all the way back there, he told them, when you go into the land, I am going to drive the people out. And then it is up to you to possess it and to not bow down to their altars. Do not worship their gods, because if you do, I'm going to no longer be with you. Remember, we talked about this idea many times, if you've been in some of my classes, that really that covenant that we see in Exodus chapter 23 and 24 is the first time God makes a conditional covenant with man. You think about it, whenever he made the promises to, even all the way back to the garden, when he made the promise to the serpent and the promises to Adam and Eve about what was going to happen, was there anything that relied on Adam and Eve to make that come true? No, God said this is going to happen. And God is the only being in the universe who can say, this is going to happen because I said so. You get to Abraham, and he makes those promises to Abraham with all those great elements, the land, the nation, the name, the peace, the protection, all the families of the earth were going to be blessed. Was any of that based on Abraham being faithful? No. God said, I'm going to do it. And when he repeats those promises to Isaac and to Jacob, there's no conditions placed on that until we get to this relationship with God and his people where he makes this covenant. And for the first time, we really see that word if in there, where God says, if you behave, and lists a whole bunch of things what behaving means, then I'm going to be your God, I will drive them out, and no one will be able to stand before you. However, if you go worship these other gods, and you go do these other things, and you offer your children in sacrifice, then what am I going to do? Now I'm going to be your enemy, okay? This is the same reason we talked about in the book of Joshua, when Joshua meets the captain of the Lord's army and says, are you for us or against us? And he says, neither. I'm on God's side. Whether you're on my side or not depends completely on if you're on God's side. If you're on God's side, I'm going to fight for you. If you aren't on God's side, I'm going to fight against you. And that's exactly what is happening here. Israel had to do their part. They had to learn obedience, okay? So God is actually going to follow through. We should not be surprised that God is going to follow through with what he said. So we read here in the second part of chapter 2, so the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he said, because this people have transgressed my covenant that I commanded their fathers and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will take care to walk by the way of the Lord as their fathers did or not. Okay? So the Lord left those nations, not driving them out quickly, and he did not give them into the hand of Joshua. Really, God wants to find out, are you going to do what you said you would do? And it's not even like we can just say, well, wait a minute, this generation never promised to follow God. Yes, they did. Remember when they first got into the land, what did they do? Joshua built the altar, he read all the things, they had the first Passover, they did the circumcision, and the covenant was renewed. This generation said exactly that same thing. We are going to follow the Lord. So we're going to see if they really did that or not. Okay? Now, as we look at the rest of the book here, really the entire rest of the book is going to cover, and how many people have heard of this before, the cycle of the judges? Probably everybody, right? Okay, this is not something that should be new or shocking to you if you've been in Bible studies of the Old Testament for very long. But yet really the steps of the cycle of the judges, there's 5 components that almost every time, every single one of these 5 components of this cycle is there. Sometimes we might not hear all the details of one of them, but basically it's there. So we're going to see that, first of all, Israel in a state of faithfulness when they first go into the land, it doesn't last very long, and then what do? They fall away. They sin, okay? So Israel is going to sin. Now, almost always, what is that sin? Idolatry. That's right. They are going to start to worship the Baals or the Ashtaroth or the Asherah. Sometimes even so bad as it says they start to offer their children in sacrifice here. So in response to that, just like God said he was going to do, if you start to worship these gods of Canaan, remember the whole reason that God let them come into the land of Canaan is because that sin in the land of Canaan was so bad that God said this needs to be wiped off the face of the earth. We need to get rid of this kind of worship, get rid of child sacrifice, and so we're going to move in there and we're going to take over. But now as soon as they start worshiping like the people in Canaan, God wants them off. So God is going to send an oppressor. That oppressor is going to take the form of another nation, whether that is sometimes a nation already living in them that they didn't drive out. That nation will rise up and kind of oppress them, or sometimes it'll be an external nation. Even things like Moab and Ammon, right, who they weren't allowed to take over because of the relationship between Lot and Abraham there. So because of that, even those those nations are going to come in and be able to oppress them. Now, as is the case with us, just as much as it is with any group of people, when things start to go bad, for a little while you think, well, maybe we can fix this. But eventually things get so bad that what do? You just have to say, I need what? I need some help. And so, of course, that's the purpose of this oppressor. The purpose of this punishment is to get Israel to realize that they need to depend on Jehovah. And so eventually they will cry out. And they will actually return to Jehovah and they will say, hey, we were wrong, please help us. God then, of course, being the God that he is, long-suffering and patient and wants his people to return to him. So when they cry out is whenever a judge will be raised. And you may remember we said that probably a better term, a description would be a deliverer. Because what is the sole purpose of this judge? To rescue them from the oppressor, right? Okay, that's the sole purpose. This is not a judge who's supposed to, rise up and become king. This is not a judge who's supposed to take over the entire nation. Not even really a judge who's supposed to be in power beyond the time it takes to deliver them from their oppressor. Okay, and then we're going to see that the land will have for a period, and again, we're told more or less about this in some of the cycles, but the land has rest. What does that really mean when it says the land has rest? Yeah, Israel has peace because they're what? Yeah, they're good again, right? So they return to Jehovah for a while, and while they are faithful, what does God give them? He gives them rest, and he gives them prosperity, okay? Not coincidentally, we're going to see that almost always that land having rest is about the time it takes a generation to die out. So just like we saw with Joshua, remember it said that the people were faithful the entire time of Joshua, and then they were also faithful for that generation who had seen the works that God had done. It's going to be the same thing in the period of Judges. When they have this oppressor and they finally get to the point where they cry out to God for help, when God sends that help and that help delivers them, that generation says, oh, now we get it. And they kind of behave. But what do they always seem to fail to do? Yeah, teach their kids, exactly. They seem to fail to pass on that faith, to pass on that belief to the next generation, and then there's going to be problems. And we start back over again, okay? Now, this is not something that I came up with. It's been around forever because it's been around as long as the book of Judges has been around. Let's take a look and see why. Turn there to chapter 2, and we're going to start reading here in verse 11, and we're going to see how this plays out. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went out after other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them, and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Asheroth. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against... Oh, let's stop there. Step 1, what do? They sin, and they go against these other gods. Okay? Let's pick up there in verse 14. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress. Again, it's not so much that this other nation all of a sudden has more power than they had before. It's really who's fighting against them. It's God, that's right, okay? So chapter 2, verses 14 to 15 tells us about that step. Now, the one section that we're not really told about here, other than it says, and they were in terrible distress, it doesn't specifically say about how they cry out. But they become in terrible distress here, and they call out to God. We'll see that when we go through the actual cycles here. Verse 16. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. And they soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord. And they did not do so. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning. That's where it mentions it, verse 18, part B. For the Lord was moved by pity because of their groaning, because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of the practices or their stubborn ways, so the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. Okay? So we see here, Israel's going to cry out, God is going to raise the judge and deliverer, and then while that judge lives, the people are what? They're good and the land has rest. But then right away, we're going to start this all over. We're going to go back to the beginning. And one of the things that this section here really tells us to watch out for, and again, God tells us what to look for. Look what it says there in verse 19. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods. So it's not like if this is our bar of faithfulness, and then that generation kind of dips off, and then God raises a judge and we come back up here. What do? They don't really come back up very much. They go down and then maybe up a little bit, and then down farther, and then maybe up a little bit, and then down farther. So this entire time, we're going to just see this incredible descent from a faithful nation who is representing God all the way down to this just absolute terrible moral degeneracy that we're going to see, especially by the time we get to the end of the book here. Now, what we're going to do next is, I believe this video is about 7 or 8 minutes long, and I will just make a little preface here. If you've been in several of the classes that I've taught before, you may know I tend to use a lot these videos and some of their graphics that this company has put out. It's a company called the BibleProject.com. You can go to the BibleProject.com. They have some fabulous videos. Their Read Through the Bible series is absolutely incredible. I don't agree with 100% of everything that some of their leaders believe and teach outside of that. Even some of their other topical videos are, well, they're questionable. Let's just put it that way. I do believe that they are very serious Bible scholars and that they are doing their best to represent. And like I said, this is going to be one of their Read Through the Bible series. They have this for every single book of the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's just a 7 or 8 minute video with some wonderful graphics that do a great job of kind of summarizing the book. So I thought we would watch that here, and then we'll just have a few minutes to wrap up. You ready?
The book of Judges. So remember after Joshua led the tribes...
Oh, hold on. Let me turn this off here so you're not hearing it in 3 places. All right. Oh, I gotta go back an extra time.
The book of Judges. So remember, after Joshua led the tribes of Israel into the promised land, he called them to be faithful to their covenant with God by obeying the commands of the Torah. And if they do this, they will show all the other nations what God is like. So Judges begins with the death of Joshua and basically tells the story of Israel's total failure. The book's name comes from the type of leaders Israel had in this period. Before they had any kings, the tribes were all governed by these judges. Now, don't think of a courtroom. These were regional political military leaders, more like a tribal chieftain. And you need to be warned, the book of Judges is very disturbing and violent. It tells the tragic tale of Israel's moral corruption, of its bad leadership, and basically how they become no different than the Canaanites. But this sad story is also meant to generate hope for the future, and you can see this in how the book's designed. There's a large introduction that sets the stage for Israel's failure as they don't drive out the remaining Canaanites. Then the large main section of the book has stories about the growing corruption of Israel's judges, and the progression here shows how Israel's leaders go from pretty good to okay to bad to worse. The concluding section is really disturbing and shows the corruption of the people of Israel as a whole. So let's dive in and we can explore each part a bit more. The opening section begins with the tribes of Israel in their territories in the Promised Land. And while Joshua defeated some key Canaanite towns, there was still a lot of land to be taken and lots of Canaanites living in those areas. And so chapter 1 gives a long list of Canaanite groups and towns that Israel just failed to drive out from the land. Now, remember, the whole point of driving out the Canaanites was to avoid their moral corruption and their way of worshiping the gods through child sacrifice. God had called Israel to be a holy people, and that does not happen. Chapter 2 describes how Israel just moved in alongside the Canaanites and adopted all their cultural and religious practices. And it's right here that the story stops. For nearly a whole chapter, the narrator gives us an overview of everything that's about to happen in the body of the book. This part of Israel's history, the narrator says, was a series of cycles moving in a downward spiral. So Israel became like the Canaanites, and so they would sin against God. So God would allow them to be conquered and oppressed by the Canaanites, and eventually the Israelites would see the error of their ways and repent. So God would raise up a deliverer, a judge from among Israel who would defeat the enemy and bring about an era of peace. But eventually Israel would sin again, and it would all start over. This cycle provides the literary design and flow for the next main section of the book. It gets repeated for each of the 6 main judges whose stories are told here. Now, the stories of the first 3 judges, Othniel, Ehud, and Deborah, they are epic adventures. They're also extremely bloody stories. Either the judge themselves or people who help the judge, they defeat their enemies and deliver the people of Israel. The stories about the next 3 judges are longer, and they focus in on the character flaws of the judges, which get increasingly worse. So Gideon, he begins pretty well. He's a coward of a man, but he eventually comes to trust that God can save Israel through him. And so he defeats a huge army of Midianites with only 300 men carrying torches and clay pots. But Gideon has a nasty temper, and he murders a bunch of fellow Israelites for not helping him in his battle. And then it all goes downhill from there. He makes an idol from the gold that he won in his battles. And then after he dies, all Israel worships the idol as a god, and the cycle begins again. The next main judge is Jephthah, who's something of a mafia thug living up in the hills. And when things get really bad for Israel, the elders come to him begging for his help. And Jephthah was a very effective leader. He won lots of battles against the Ammonites, but he was so unfamiliar with the God of Israel, he treats him like a Canaanite god. He vows to sacrifice his daughter if he wins the battle. This tragic story, it shows just how far Israel has fallen. They no longer know the character of their own God, which leads to murder and to false worship. The last judge, Samson, is by far the worst. His life began full of promise, but he has no regard for the God of Israel. He was promiscuous, violent, and arrogant. He did win brutally strategic victories over the Philistines, but only at the expense of his own integrity, and his life ends in a violent rush of mass murder. Now, a quick note here. You'll notice a repeated theme in the main section of the book, that at key moments, God's Spirit will empower each of these judges to accomplish these great acts of deliverance. Now, the fact that God uses these really screwed up people doesn't mean he endorses all or even any of their decisions. God is committed first and foremost to saving his people, but all he has to work with is these corrupt leaders. And so work with them he does. This whole section is designed to show just how bad things have gotten. You can't even tell the Israelites and the Canaanites apart anymore, and that's just the leaders. The final section shows Israel as a whole hitting bottom. There are 2 tragic stories here, and they are not for the faint of heart. They're structured by this key line that gets repeated 4 times at the close of the book. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. The first story is about an Israelite named Micah who builds a private temple to an idol, and that gets plundered by a private army sent from the tribe of Dan. So they come and they steal everything, and then they go and burn down the peaceful city of Laish and murder all of its inhabitants. It's a horrifying story. When Israel forgets its God, might makes right. The final story of the book is even worse. It's a shocking tale of sexual abuse and violence, which all leads to Israel's first civil war. It's very disturbing. And that's the point. These stories are meant to serve as a warning. Israel's descent into self-destruction is the result of turning away from the God who loves them and saved them out of slavery in Egypt. And now Israel needs to be delivered again from themselves. The only glimmer of hope in this story is found in this repeated line in the last part of the book. It actually forms the last sentence of the story. Israel has no king. And so the stage is set for the following books to tell the origins of King David's family, the book of Ruth, and also the origins of kingship itself in Israel, the book of 1 Samuel. But the story of Judges has value as a tragedy. It's a sobering explanation of the human condition, and ultimately it points out the need for God's grace to send a king who will rescue his people. And that's the book of Judges.
Pretty good. They do a really good job of highlighting that and pointing that out. And one of the things that I'm sure the rest, both myself and the other two guys are going to point out, one of the statements that they make there, and actually it's in that top right corner there where he talked about that the Spirit of God moves into these judges and empowers them to defeat their enemies and to take over. One of the things that is definitely true, we see over and over and over in the Bible, is that God uses the people that he has in order to accomplish his will. Does that always mean that he agrees with everything that they do? No. In fact, many times they are held up as kind of that anti-example, right? This is how you should not behave. Even though, yes, God used them to accomplish his will, there is no way that God is going to say, this should be your role model, which is where people get really kind of confused when we look at the book of Judges here. We think about, these are the kind of people that God wants us to be like? Absolutely not, okay? These are a group of people, as we go through this book, one of the things I really want you to kind of focus on is that this is a group of people who at the beginning of the book, they had everything. Remember in the time of Joshua, they took entire nations with, we believe, probably not even losing a single soldier in the battles. Several of the battles it mentions, God killed more of the enemy either by some of the things that he did or by casting down the hailstones, where God killed more of the enemy than Israel did by the sword. God was doing the work for them. They were able to move into the land, and you remember during the 40 years of wandering, they didn't even have to come up with their own food because God gave them the manna and the quail. But then they move into the land, the manna and the quail stop because they move into a land at the time of harvest. And all they have to do is go out and reap the rewards of somebody else's work. So they are literally a people that were given everything. And if they had just remained faithful, things would have been great. But unfortunately, I think many times, just like us, without that kind of strife, whenever everything is going right, what do we start to tend to think? Well, maybe I don't need God, right? Maybe I can do this on my own. And what does the book of Judges show us more than anything? What happens when people think they can do it on their own? Remember the second part of that phrase? So that he mentioned there, it happens 4 times at the end of the book. In those days of Israel had no king, and every man did what was right in the sight of his own eyes. When people do just what is right in the sight of their own eyes, it's going to not work out very well for anybody, okay? And that really is going to be the lesson of the book as we go through each one of these stories here, okay? All right. Can't believe I'm going to beat that bell, but only by 30 or so seconds. So on Sunday, we will pick up there in Judges chapter 3, and we'll look at Othniel and the first 3 cycles of Judges here. And I think Josh is taking that, right? Josh is up for that.
Where did you say you could find those videos at? What was the name of that?
It's called The Bible Project. Yeah, The Bible Project.